Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
Begin.
Can tests really tell us how smart we are? How well adjusted we are? And what goes on in our subconscious minds? Or are they unfair barriers, narrowing our definitions of intelligence, competence, and mental health? Testing and Intelligence, this time on Discovering Psychology. Let me ask you a personal question. How smart are you? One way you could answer is to list your accomplishments, your grades, your job, your possessions, or you might point out all the things you're good at. Anything from solving crossword puzzles to inventing a better mousetrap. Or you could give me just one number, your IQ. If you say your IQ is 100, you've told me that you're average in certain aspects of intelligence compared to most people. That means half the population for which the test was developed will have higher scores than yours, and half will have lower. But can the richness and complexity of intelligence really be reduced to a number? And why do psychologists spend so much time and effort trying to get this number and others like it? And perhaps most importantly, what effect can such numbers have on your life? Today we're going to try to answer these questions by focusing on the field of psychological assessment. Its goal, to find out how people differ in their abilities, behaviors, and personalities. Using a variety of testing methods, psychologists try to put a tape measure to the mind. How people differ has long been an object of fascination. But psychologists have taken the measurement of these differences as their special province. Their tool is psychometrics, mental testing in all its varieties.
While the test is being administered,
The most well-known tests are those measuring some aspects of intelligence. And then there are tests like the SAT, which measures your developed academic abilities. And there are tests that measure your learning in specific subject areas. Together, all these tests are called cognitive tests because they measure various aspects of your mental ability. There are also personality tests, which try to measure the non-cognitive parts of human personality, your interests, values, and personality traits. Projective tests, like the Rorschach, help some clinical psychologists assess mental and emotional problems. What you see in ambiguous inkblot patterns is then interpreted as reflecting your innermost thoughts. While in the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory Test, you're asked to answer true or false to hundreds of statements about different attitudes and beliefs. Your responses are then used to derive a set of personality characteristics and to assess whether they're more like the characteristics of people who are deemed normal or abnormal. For all these tests, the bottom line is to gather a sample of responses conveniently and inexpensively, and then to use these responses to predict with a minimum of error an individual's future performance in some real-life situation. In fact, testing has become so convenient and inexpensive and so pervasive, it's hard to imagine a time when someone wasn't being tested. If we eliminate God's famous apple test of Adam and Eve's willpower, then the earliest recorded system of assessment was probably established by the emperors of ancient China. As early as 2200 BC, a civil service testing program was instituted for government officials. In modern times, Sir Francis Galton of England was one of the key figures in the development of mental measurements. At the turn of the century, Galton tried to demonstrate the hereditary basis of intelligence. His work triggered a long tradition of controversy over the relative contributions of heredity and environment to intelligence. The other great early figure in assessment was a Frenchman named Alfred Binet, who published the first workable intelligence test in 1905. Binet's test was devised to measure intellectual performance of school children, so that teachers could classify and separate retarded children from normal ones. The test was meant to replace the teacher's more subjective and often biased evaluations. Binet believed that his test scores were only a practical estimate of current performance, not a measure of innate intelligence. He believed that test results should only be used to help identify those areas in which children needed special help. But the educators who administered his test rarely made these distinctions, as we'll see later. The key to Binet's approach was the quantification of a student's performance. First, a great number of children of various ages were tested, and an average score or norm was obtained for normal children in each age group. Then an individual child's performance was compared to the average score for his or her age. Test results were expressed in terms of mental age. When a child's score was average for a group of 5-year-olds, then the child was said to have a mental age of 5, regardless of his or her actual chronological age. Nowhere did Binet's test have a greater impact than in the United States. Millions of people were streaming in from Europe and Asia, and a vast public school system was emerging. How could the mental abilities of these newcomers be assessed? And there was also a flood of recruits enlisting in the army during the First World War. They too had to be tested for intelligence and aptitude. Assessment was being seen as a way to bring order to a chaotic society. An inexpensive, democratic way of separating out those who could benefit from education or military training from those who were deemed incompetent. Eventually, there was a growing acceptance of the idea that intelligence tests could be used to differentiate people in terms of their leadership ability and other socially important characteristics. And there was also growing attention given to alleged intellectual differences according to race and ethnic background. Statistics were used to support bogus arguments that blacks were inferior, as well as immigrants, like my grandparents and perhaps yours. In 1916, Lewis Terman of Stanford University adapted Binet's test for American school children. The new version was commonly known as the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Test. With it, Terman would provide the foundation for a new concept, the intelligence quotient, or IQ. This quotient, as it was measured then, was the ratio of mental age to chronological age, multiplied by 100 to eliminate decimals. Thus, a child with a chronological age of 8, whose test score equaled that of a 10-year-old, would have an IQ of 125. The new Stanford-Binet test soon became a standard instrument in clinical psychology, psychiatry, and educational counseling. And more importantly, Terman and others came to believe, unlike Binet, that intelligence was an inequality, that it had a large hereditary component, and that so-called IQ tests could measure this inequality. The implicit message was that IQ characterizes something essential and unchanging about human nature, our inherited intelligence. The next milestone in intelligence testing was the work of this man, psychologist David Wechsler. In 1939, Wechsler designed a new test to solve a major problem of intelligence tests in general, their dependence on language, a problem for non-English speakers and small children. So he developed new nonverbal sections to go along with the verbal sections. In this example, test takers are asked to put these pictures in a logical sequence. Since the development of the original Wechsler intelligence scales in 1939, later revisions have become the most frequently used assessment tool in the country. More than 3 million people a year take it. Psychological testing has become a big business in America. There are thousands of psychologists whose main work revolves around using them. But how do we know if they do what they're supposed to do? A good place to start is to ask, what is it that makes a test valuable to a tester? Here at Howard University, the late William Curtis Banks looked at potential misuse and racial bias in aptitude testing.
A test, first and foremost, has to be valid. The test has to be able to be demonstrated to measure what it is that you're interested in. If it is intended to measure the ability of a young person to do well in college, then the test should yield a score which actually predicts how well the person does in college. If the test is intended to predict how well an individual can perform a job, let's say of a police lieutenant, then the test score should actually predict and should be consistent with the individual's ability to actually perform that job when he is in it. Secondly, the test needs to be reliable, because in order to be valid, it needs to measure whatever it is we're interested in the same way each time it's used. And three, we need to be careful in standardizing the test to make sure that the people that we use to establish its initial validity and reliability are the same people that we're going to use the test with to measure later on.
So not only do the tests themselves have to be assessed, we also have to assess how they're used or misused. Alfred Binet's dream, which is still shared by many, was that psychological assessment would replace subjective biased evaluations with objective ones. In the United States, testing has been championed as a democratic tool to eliminate arbitrary and biased evaluations of people based on such irrelevant criteria as race, sex, nationality, social class, and physical appearance. But these lofty goals are often lost when test results become not the keys to the kingdom, but a passport to nowhere. There is no area of psychology more enmeshed in controversy than that of assessment.
The way that competency tests have been used in a biased way in the past, and currently in some instances, is by using the results of them to tell us that certain people are not really capable of doing something when they actually are. The reason why the tests tell us that sometimes is because they have been developed in such a way as not to take full account of the different ways, in some instances, in which different people do the same job.
Many educators also worry about the problem of teaching for tests instead of for basic knowledge.
It's not that we're concerned if people are able to do well at the test. What we're concerned about is if they're able to do well at the test, but they're not able to do well at anything else. And if they're coached specifically for the test, regardless of whether we're talking about a test in the area of vocational